With the announcement of the Nikon Z6 III imminent, you might be asking yourself, especially if you're shopping or intending to shop for a Nikon interchangeable lens camera, what camera body might be the best fit for me? In this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience with a range of Nikon Z mount camera bodies and why I chose the Nikon Z8. We'll get started with back at the end of 2023 when my Nikon Z8 first arrived, and I hadn't even had the chance to use it yet, to now, 6 months later, when I've had the chance to use it quite a bit and can give it a good comparison to what I've used in the past. Let's get started. So this is the Nikon Z6 II, and this has been the primary camera body in my camera bag for most of the last 2 years. This is the Nikon Z8, which has just arrived to me this week, and I haven't even had the chance to use it yet. But this will take the place of my Nikon Z6 II in my camera bag. So let's compare these two cameras just a little bit. So why am I replacing the Z6 II with this somewhat bigger and bulkier and heavier camera body? Let's talk about that. So I started my journey with the Nikon mirrorless cameras at the beginning of 2022 with the Nikon Z6 II. Since that time, I also had a first generation Nikon Z7 for about 6 months at the beginning of this year. And I've also used the Nikon Z9 on loan from Nikon 3 different times for about a month's time in total this year. So I've had some experience through the Nikon mirrorless line now, and I'm going to share some honest opinions about that. So first of all, I'm going to talk about my experience with the Nikon Z mirrorless system so far. I started out with this Nikon Z6 II pretty much at the very beginning of 2022, almost 2 years ago. And in retrospect, I'm really glad that I started out with the second generation camera instead of the first generation. At the time, I didn't know that, but I was more just going, okay, this one has a few new features that the first generation didn't have. It has the dual X-Speed 6 processors instead of a single one. It's dual card slot, which I always really appreciate. It's probably worth it for me to go ahead and get the second generation. It has some features that are important to me. And so that's what I did. But a year later, or almost a year later, at the end of last year, Nikon was offering a really, really good deal on the first generation Z7. So I thought, well, that extra resolution might be nice. Having a second camera body would be nice. Let me go ahead and get that and try that out. And what I found was some of those missing first generation features and the first generation autofocus that wasn't quite as good and tended to make more mistakes started to get somewhat frustrating a lot of the times. You know, weird things would happen with the raw files where their metadata would just get dropped and disappear. I'm not sure why that was happening. So after about 6 months of using the Z7 and with the Z8 having been released, I thought, well, this really isn't working out the way I wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and sell this, go back to using the Z6 II until I can get my Z8 order in. And so that's what I did. But I will say, if that first generation Z7 had been my first Z-mount camera, it's very possible I would have gone running back to a trusty DSLR and may have taken a fair amount of convincing and features and upgrades to the system to come back to the Z mount. But because I already had that second generation Z6 II experience, I knew that what I was fighting with that first generation Z7 was more just first generation bugs that somewhat had already been worked out. And by that point, I also had the experience using the Nikon Z9, which is the flagship camera of the line, and had really good experiences with that. Not enough that I wanted to buy one, and I've talked about that in a separate video here on the channel, but overall really good experiences. But it's also a really big and bulky camera, even way bigger than this Nikon Z8, because the Z9 has a bigger battery that goes across the bottom of this and just makes it a bigger camera. Has some things that I don't necessarily need in it as a landscape photographer. And again, I've talked about that in a separate video, so I won't get too deep into it here. So back to the Z6 II, I went for a few more months as my primary and only camera body. But by this past summer, with the Z8 having been released, it was my goal to move to that. And why is that? Well, the Z8 has almost all the features of that larger Z9, but in a smaller form factor. Now, to give you a sense of comparison, besides showing it next to the smaller Z6 II, if you're familiar with the Nikon D850 with digital SLR, this is basically the same size as that. It's, a tenth of an inch different here, a tenth of an inch different there. This is 5 grams lighter than the D850. It's shaped a little bit different just from the mirrorless form factor instead of the digital SLR. But if you're going to hold them in your hand with your eyes closed, you probably wouldn't tell the difference. It's basically the same size, basically the same weight. But it has, like I said, almost all of the features of the Nikon Z9 built into this. Things that it's missing because of the smaller battery, shorter battery life, doesn't have built-in GPS, maybe a couple other things that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but still has that stacked sensor that the Z6 and Z7 lines don't have. Still has the same frame rates as the Z9 as far as speed, just the same Xpeed 7 processor that does everything faster. So all around, it's just almost 9/10 of the Z9 in a smaller size body for about $1,000 less money, maybe $1,500. So for me, I almost look at this camera as like the Goldilocks of the Nikon mirrorless line right now. The Z9's a little bit too big and a little bit more than what I need. This has done really well, but this is also only a 24 megapixel camera. This is 45, and it's almost as good as this in low light situations for my astrophotography and stuff like that. It's bigger, but not that much bigger. I can still comfortably carry this around all day. And it's a little more robust with its bigger size. It's a little tougher built. So I almost feel like this is that sweet spot for me and for what I do. Now, I did say I have not used this camera body at all yet. I just got it, just came in, my order from Nikon a couple days ago. But because this is so much like the Z9, and because I've used the Z9 quite a bit, like I said, I had about a month's worth of experience using it in a lot of different conditions, I feel like I know this thing pretty well already, even though I haven't shot with it yet. And I feel like I have a pretty good idea of what kind of results I'm going to get with it because I've seen what I got from the Z9. And it's the same image sensor, same focusing system, same image processor. So I feel like I know what I'm going to get. And I'm excited to get out and try it out. So I've gotten a lot of great results with the Z6 II. It's served me well, but it's time to move on to the new thing with more resolution, even more speed, more performance. And it doesn't hurt that Nikon gave me a great deal on the trade-in during the Black Friday shopping season for the Z6 II to trade up to the Z8. So, first impressions and why I'm making the switch. We'll start the video with that, and we'll get out of the field and try this thing out. But that's my first commentary on why I've made the switch to the Z8 from the Z6 II, and in particular the Z8 as opposed to like a Z7 II or the Z9. This is just that sweet spot of right in between, with all the resolution power of the Z7 II and the Z9, a little more speed than the Z7 II, a little bit nicer focusing system, a little bit nicer features, and that smaller form factor than the Z9 matters for me when I take this thing hiking. I don't need that big, huge body. And I'll just carry extra batteries for this to get the battery life I need. So let's get out there in the field and try this thing out. Hello everybody from Guanella Pass. Back there behind me is Mount Bierstadt. And tonight I have made the journey up here on the opening weekend for the pass to try and capture the sunset, although that wasn't so productive, and the Milky Way over Mount Bierstadt, which I hope will be more productive. I'm also going to do some commentary on my Nikon Z8 while I'm here. So, still a pretty decent amount of snow up here. I've seen more on Memorial Day weekend than there is this year up at this location at the top of the pass, but still a decent amount of snow up here for sure. And other areas in the Colorado mountains have even more, like Trail Ridge Road and Rocky Mountain National Park, Independence Pass, Kibler Pass. Those are all passes that did not open this weekend, even though they would normally be expected to. So I'm going to get some of my gear out here, get set up, and we'll do some video before it gets dark, and then hopefully these clouds over the mountains will clear out completely and we'll be able to get some Milky Way. Let's get started. So I am out here with my Nikon Z8, and it has now been about 6 months since it arrived at my door. So I've gotten a fair amount of use out of it now, enough to feel like I can give some impressions of my experience with it. I'm going to start with looking at the camera body itself. I have it here mounted on my tripod with the L bracket. L brackets are wonderful things. As you can see the live view display there on the back. It's a really nice display. I like the leveling system they have there. Well, it might be hard to see on this camera. And also one thing I really love about that display on the back of the camera is when I am taking night photos, like with the Nikon Z9, I can actually see the stars, the Milky Way, all the things. When I was photographing the aurora a few weeks ago, I could actually see the aurora and the live view on the back of my camera. I love the way that the Z8 and Z9 have that really nice view on the back. I'll show you here as well. It may not show up super great, but we have the illuminated buttons. Now I really like having illuminated buttons, but there is a trade-off to that, which I originally thought was a missing feature. So on my Nikon Z6 II, up here on this top display, when I am doing long exposures, and this has long exposures that go out to 15 minutes long in manual mode. And one thing I really loved about the Z6 II is I could look at that top display while that long exposure was running and see how much time was left. So really nice when you're doing, 4 or 5 minute foreground exposures for night shots to be able to see how much time is left. And in using the Z9 and in my early days with the Z8, I thought that feature is missing. Well, what is actually happening is the illuminated buttons on the back and the illumination for the top display are part of the same function. And what happens when you press the shutter button to start an exposure is that illumination turns off. And so it also turns off the illumination for the top display, which means in the dark, without shining a light on it, I can no longer read any information that's on there, including the countdown timer for the long exposures. So the feature is still there, it's just a lot harder to use. So is that a worth it trade-off to have the illuminated buttons? Probably so, because that's also super helpful for somebody like me that can't see very well in the dark. To be able to not have to turn a light on to fumble around and push the right button on the back of my camera is super handy for me and anybody else that's out doing night photography with me. I'm sure they appreciate that a fair amount. So we'll get the camera back in the frame here so you can see it. This is definitely a physically larger camera than the Z6, Z7 series Nikons that I'd shot with for the last couple years. Don't mind the gust of wind here. I am up above tree line on Memorial Day weekend, so it's getting a little breezy from time to time. Okay, that's starting to pipe down. But this is a noticeably larger and heavier camera than the Z6, Z7 series cameras that I've had. You can see it in the picture from my thumbnail, sitting on the desk next to my old Z6 II before I sent it in. It's actually within a few ounces and, fractions of an inch wise dimensions weight to the same as the Nikon D850. So if you're familiar with that camera, if you've been using that camera, the Z8 will feel very familiar in hand. Both its weight, its size, the placement of the buttons, all those things. So the trade-off you get with that is it gets almost all the capabilities of the Z9 and a smaller camera body that's also quite a bit less expensive. Things you give up: long battery life because it's using the smaller battery of the Z6, Z7 series cameras instead of that big battery of the Z9 that lasts quite a while. You're also losing the built-in GPS capability that the Z9 has, although you can get location tagging back by connecting your phone to the camera using the SnapBridge app. So, not a total loss, but it's not built into the camera body. I'm trying to think of what other features you really lose, but maybe some heat dissipation if you're doing video for long stretches of time, just because the camera body is smaller. It's probably gives up a little bit in ruggedness, although probably not much. I mean, this is still a well-built camera. So even that, I'd probably be iffy on whether you're really losing anything there or not. You are still getting that high resolution, 45 megapixels, the same sensor from the Z9. Its low light, high ISO performance is still very, very good. The advantage that you get of these new stacked sensors, it's kind of a best of both worlds situation. You can get high resolution and very good high ISO performance at the same time, and I definitely have nothing to complain about there. It does a great job. The only thing it does with that 45 megapixels as opposed to the 24 of the Z6 II that I was shooting night photography with before, I have to tighten up my shutter speeds or use the tracker even more on the long exposures for the stars, because it'll make that star movement show up even quicker just from the high resolution. But as far as everything else in comparison to the Z9, I think pretty much everything else is there. And the firmware updates have added the pixel shift feature, so you can get up to like 180 megapixels if you use that pixel shift feature. Obviously you have to be on a tripod, your subject has to be still, but I haven't even really tried that yet because I haven't been in a good situation to try it out.
but I imagine the detail that it would capture in that would be just dramatic. Overall, I really am satisfied with this camera. Traded in my Z6 II to get it, so right now it's the only camera body I have, and I see no reason to change that anytime soon. The only thing is, during the solar eclipse in April, I loaned another Z8 from Nikon so I could have two of them to have two different photo opportunities going during the solar eclipse. But it's a really great camera body that I have really enjoyed using. So I give it really high marks, and it's probably hits the sweet spot in the Nikon lineup for almost everybody in that prosumer market. Really checks all the boxes. Not the full-on pro Z9 with its big size and weight and all the features, but it's 95% of that in a smaller package and at a little bit lower price. Not inexpensive, mind you. This is still a $3,500 camera at this point in time, but you're getting a good value when compared to the $5,500 price of the Z9. Probably the only real complaint I have with this camera and day-to-day operation of it is because of its smaller size and the smaller battery. It does tend to plow through the battery, I won't lie. You'll definitely go through a battery in a night of doing night photography shooting. And in fact, the Z8 I was using during the solar eclipse to take photos every minute with the telephoto lens over the 3 hours. It did exhaust an entire battery during that, and I had to replace it about 2 hours in. So this camera will plow through some batteries. I've always been a guy that's had 2 batteries for my cameras. At some point I may go ahead and grab a third one just to have 2 backups for situations where I might be off the grid for a while. Even though like both of the vehicles that I drive now have 110 adapters, so I do have the ability to charge the batteries in my car. You know, I always like to have backups just in case. It has gotten dark now. I've gotten my camera set up on my Skywatcher Star Adventurer Star Tracker, and we're still a little bit early as far as setting up for our shot. I'll turn my light off here so you can get a better view of what the back of the camera looks like at night. Let me see if I can get to adjust the exposure so you can see it better. Well, basically, you can see with my settings set up appropriately, like I have a pretty good view on the back of the camera of what my picture is going to look like. And this is, as I've said many times before, one of my favorite features of the Z8 and the Z9. I can look out into the darkness. I can see Mount Bierstadt and the Sawtooth. I can see the clouds in the sky. We still have a little bit before the Milky Way comes up from behind Mount Bierstadt there, but I can see the other stars in the sky around that I'm able to focus on. So it just makes doing these nighttime images in particular much easier. So it's about time to bring this video to a close now. But I'll do that by reviewing my feelings on all the different cameras in the Nikon Z full frame line, as I have very little experience with the crop sensor Z-mount cameras. The Z5, of course, is the bottom end of that, is $1,000. That is the one that I really haven't used at all, and so I can't really comment much on it. It is a 24 megapixel camera. It's not a backside illuminated sensor like the Z6 line or the brand new ZF. So I'm sure it has some limitations because of that, but as an entry-level full-frame camera, I'm going to guess that it will do pretty good for its category. The Z6 II, of course, had a lot of experience with that. I've talked about that extensively in my videos. The new Z6 III is about to be released, and it will get some nice feature bumps, I'm sure, including up to 6K video. A little faster frame rates, up to closer to the 20 frames per second that the Z8 gets, I think. But at the end of the day, it is still that 24 megapixel camera that's built for good high ISO performance, good video, those kind of things. And honestly, it'll probably fall pretty close to where the Nikon ZF is right now, which got some feature bumps from the Z6 II as well. Now, I have not had the chance to use the new Nikon ZF yet. It's kind of a retro styled version of the Z6 line. Perhaps I'll get one on loan from Nikon Professional Services here soon to see what I think of that. And I've pondered getting that as a second camera, as a backup to the Z8 to shoot video, have in reserve, stuff, things like that. So possibly more to come with that. Of course, I've talked about my experience with the first generation Z7. I have used the second generation Z7 II as well, and it is a very solid camera. We're up to 45 megapixels at that point. You can acquire one of those right now for $2,300, so a lot less than the $3,000 or maybe even a little bit more that it was when it was brand new. It's a very solid camera, and honestly, if you don't need the 20 frames per second of the Nikon Z8 or Z9, if you don't need 8K video and things like that, you know, it's probably a pretty good option for you. It's not going to do as well in high ISO situations as a Z6 II or a Z8 or a ZF, Z9, but you know, you're probably splitting hairs at that point. It is a really nice camera. My little bit of time that I spent with it as a loaner from NPS, it does a really good job, so it's not a bad camera. But stepping up to the top of the line with the Nikon Z8 and the Nikon Z9. Z9 is still out there for $5,500. It is the flagship of the line, and it performs that way in just about every way possible. But as I've said before, the Nikon Z8 has so much in common. It's like a mini Z9. You lose very little stepping down to that. And for me, it is the right choice. And the fact that as it sits right now, Nikon is offering a deal on the Nikon Z8 to get it for $3,500. Now $2,000 less than the Nikon Z9 for the little bit that you give up in battery performance and a few other minor features. That's really just the sweet spot for me as a working professional who wants that 45 megapixel SAC sensor, who wants the speed of the 20 frames per second, the ability to shoot 8K video with it, who will get the benefit out of those things, and yet take advantage of the smaller size in comparison to the Z9 for when I'm out hiking around, camping, backpacking, those kind of things. It really is the perfect fit for me, so that's why I've made the choice to go with the Nikon Z8 as my day-to-day #1 camera body, and probably will for quite some time looking forward. I'll wrap this video up here, and I'll share with you some of the favorite photos I captured with the Nikon Z8 over the last 6 months. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, give it a like. Maybe drop a comment below with your response to it if you've enjoyed this video, if you've had some experience with the Nikon Z8 yourself or one of the other Nikon Z-mount full frame cameras. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you've enjoyed the channel. Almost all of my watch time still comes from people who have not subscribed to the channel. I'd love to have you join me on the journey. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.